and invite a person in-house here, and that person is our director, Jānis Sārts. Jānis, well, thank you for being here. It's not like you really had a choice. When we announced that we are going to have this discussion, our public broadcaster on Twitter wrote that Jānis Sārts is going to look at his crystal ball and tell what's going to happen in 2021. So you have probably had a bit of time to look at your crystal ball. What did you see?
Well, I spent a lot of time looking for the crystal ball, but and at the same time thinking, what can I say? So it's not about crystal ball, it's about what my brain came up with. So I think the key things will be, there'll be a tremendous effort to counter the anti-vaccination disinformation. I think that will be one of the key themes and trends for the next year. I think it is already emerging. But as the vaccination rolls out, it will be, I think, one of the most notable elements, at least first half of 2021, which in kind of context also will determine how successfully countries will be able to get out of this pandemic situation, how quickly they'll be able to reignite their economies, and what will be their relative position in a world as it will be post-pandemic. So the ones that will not be successful in fighting this disinformation will have a better, they will have not as good starting point in getting out. And unfortunately, I would say, especially the authoritarian systems that will be kind of just ordering people to take that vaccine will have a better position in that respect. So that will be first. Secondly, I think what we'll see continuously the deep divide within our own societies. I think that's been the trend for 2020, and it's not going to disappear. Unfortunately, I think it's going to get just deeper, and that is going to cause a number of subsequent effects, including politically as well as on the international stage, in my view. Third thing is there are going to be continuation of digitization of the information, and I think we'll increasingly see that malign actors would be exploiting more the facts that the society is basically consuming digital information. We'll talk about data, we'll talk about fakes, we can talk about deep fakes. All of that, I think, will be on the increase next year. And ultimately, we always say that strategic communication is not only about what you talk, it's going to be about, it's also about the things that you do, decide, and the experiences. And I think it will be also the kind of parallel to 2020, where the ones that will have successful governance models and successful governance capabilities, or the governments that can do this crisis management better, will have the most successful strategic communications, and thus be more successful to managing the crisis as it will be lasting in 2021. The ones that have governments that are less so prepared for various reasons also will have not as good strategic communications, and there'll be also effects on the standing of that particular nation in post-pandemic 2021 and further down the road international order.
And communication and disinformation really have been at the forefront of the news lately. If we look a bit back, I know you are looking forward, but I will be looking back a bit. If we look at 2019, we did our first experiment with armed forces to see how they are prepared in the digital arena. And later on, we published also a report how they can be better protected in the digital space. And in 2019 we did our first experiment in social media, checking how well they are ready to work with fake likes and shares and views, etc. And well, has anything really changed in 2020? Are we really better prepared to face challenges in the digital space today?
I hope at least those ones that we targeted back in 2018 are better prepared. I'm pretty sure about it. But more seriously, I think what we see with the infodemic as we see it right now, it's not quite the case for the general public. And I'm afraid also within the military there's the room for improvement, let's put it that way. There's been, of course, a apprehension that this information space and data and all the potential fakery in the online environment can affect the soldiers, and there's been upgrade in the security procedures and etc., etc. But I think that's clearly one of these areas where there still remains a vulnerability. But in this respect, when we talk about the strategic communication, influence operations and national security, even if the military do their best, it doesn't really solve the problem. Because if the general public is still falling for it, it's still a problem. And I think that's the core of the issue right now, as we've seen with infodemic, where people very readily fell for loads of different types of disinformation or misinformation even sometimes, and actually acted in the ways that was educated by that misinformation. Therefore, I do believe, unfortunately, our societies are still not up to this challenge of the new information environment, this ability to distinguish between real and fake, ability to distinguish between the fact and fiction, and distinguish between the opinion and fact. And I think that's been put all in the same pot, and many people are struggling.
And well, if you look back at trainings that the center has done, probably you can also see a patterns which for which capabilities there is a bigger need lately.
Well, let's look at it from that perspective. First thing that we've seen is there's increased understanding that strategic communication is a very important element of your ability to survive in the modern world. As a country, as a government, as a nation, as a group, and as an individual. That's, I think, first. That's been a marked difference from like 5 years ago. First. Second, I think and I kind of alluded to that when I talked about 2021, and that's that what you say is important, but much more important is what you do and what people experience because of your actions. And therefore the quality of your decisions that would influence what is happening are the core element of strategic communication. And I think that is kind of setting in, but not necessarily readily translatable into everyday kind of strategic communication practices. But I think from my perspective, I've always reminded people what you say is secondary to what you do. And if you mess the doing part, no beautiful sayings will save that first mistake. And I think that's where we're getting kind of boost in the training set, and I hope at some point in time in the future we'll see that boost also on a real-time events. Unfortunately, this is an area where still there's an option to grow. And ultimately, the understanding that if you don't have the ability to understand the big data, the technological trends, if you don't have the ability to invite AI help in understanding the environment, as well as what and who is pushing whatever narrative is also something. So it's not like I read the newspapers and I know what's happening in given nation. You have to go far more deeper than that, and only that will give you ability to know the terrain you're operating in. If you take it away, you're basically operating with blinds on your eyes, and of course that you might by chance be successful, but most of the time you would not.
Well, I'm going to go back a bit and talk about the social media companies. Lately, there has been a lot of discussions about regulations on social media, and you have yourself talked about this a lot during the last 2 years on the media. What is your take on regulations? How should they look like?
Well, first, I think there'll be a significant debate about what to do with the social media companies next year. I think the EU has just recently come up with some ideas. There's a trend in the US as well. And I think the first thing that we have to understand, the dominance of a few Western, typically American social media companies that dominate the world is disappearing. We see Chinese coming in. We see like TikTok, there was a big debate. There'll be more. We see that one of the key drivers for protests and ability to coordinate protests in Belarus was none of these well-known Western platforms. That was a Telegram that did that, or served as a platform for opposition. So this dominance, I think, is going away. Why regulation is important is that we can establish finally the rules. For instance, to me, it's about how much or how good care these companies take on the citizens and consumers that exist in these companies. You, Linda, remember we did this number of times, this experiment about buying fake views, likes, comments, etc., on very, very vibrant fakery market for social media. And all of that was very successful and very cheap at basically no pushback from the companies. Yes, we just recently finished another one which coincided with the time of the US presidential elections. We'll be publishing that next week. Unfortunately, there's not a huge improvement. So first, take good care of the customer. So that's not that has to be, through regulation, if they've not been repeatedly able to do so, has to be done. Second, I think through the US elections, finally, companies started to realize they have to do some moderation. And in my view, the kind of that also shouldn't be from a company's perspective, but there has to be a kind of nationwide or international consensus what is and what is not acceptable in the online environment. And ultimately, and I think the most important for the future, is what happens with the data. Because I've been repeating all the time that data is the key driver for the future economies, future technologies. And it's been too easy to access that data by any actor that's interested. And from our perspective, the people that look at the malign influence campaigns using information space for influence, ability to get the data of the target audience at a very granular detail is unacceptable, because it takes away all the kind of privacy of an individual, but also creates a significant national security risk, in my view. And therefore, I don't think we have to, like in a TikTok case, we zoomed on a particular company because of the ownership area. I think we should zoom on these companies because of the practices, and look whether these practices have been in accordance with the rule of law and the way we want to see that in democracy or not. And that should be a benchmark. And I think the sooner we get that benchmark and get that benchmark right, the better will be the quality of the whole information environment. And also the newcomers that will come eventually from all parts of the world with the social media approaches, social media kind of apps and other solutions, they will know the standard. And I think that will be important.
Mm. You already also mentioned the EU Digital Services Act. There's also the first question that has come in. Well, the report really has been published only yesterday, but the question is, can we expect an evaluation or critique of that act by the Center of Excellence?
No, well, we will of course look at it. We'll have an opinion. I don't think we were going to do a critique as you do the critique on a theater or a movie. Well, there'll be something we'll of course share with our partners in the EU, but I don't think that that will be something that we'll do as a show.
I will, I think I will slowly go into the questions because I can see that we are starting to get some. But there is one question that we actually got prior to the event, and it was sent in via email, and it is by Gina Gioni, who is the president of Youth Atlantic Treaty Association, and her question is goes like this: in terms of communicating NATO's values and messages, how can the youth enhance their chances to be heard from this alliance? And at the other hand, how can we as youth better understand the messages to be multiplied in the midst of recent disinformation campaigns?
Well, I think youth has a specific way of being what I call, born digital natives. They probably haven't gone through a lot of theory of how to operate in the online environment. They would typically have an instinct, and they would certainly operate in the places where official organizations tend to overlook, Snapchats, the same TikTok has been, and a number of other areas. And also the way of formulating these things are different than what would you expect from especially the official government organizations. So if I would talk about what would be the added value for those who already understood the value of coming together and standing side by side each other for making sure that we're all together secure, that's translating that idea into the ways and means that is understandable to their peers. As for the Alliance, to hear the youth, I think Alliance, especially in the last few years, has made a special effort to listen to the to youth and what are their concerns. And I would say, luckily, we have not for a long time lived in the world where the first concern of a youth in any of the NATO member countries would be the security. And that's a blessing, because you don't have to think about, and it's like what their youth should be about. You should do different crazy things, explore things, rather than think, very carefully, is it secure for my nation or not? But unfortunately, I do believe that the world is changing, and it is not going to be as secure as it used to be for many various reasons. And I think Alliance has to be able to take in the notions from youth, because if they're not understanding the risks, then they're not being these positive contributors. And after all, who are the people that come into the military? These are youth. So there's a specific reason to address that, and I think therefore for the Alliance as well as for the military, there are two ways to listen. One is to general use, the other through the military system, where it's not only about getting a recruit training and etc., but actually having it as a measure to understand the reasons, the motivations, as well as the way to get them kind of understand the overall picture and the role of security, national security and international security in their everything they do.
Well, and youth is just such a diverse group of people. These could be 20-year-olds, but nowadays I see youth conferences that are made for 35-year-olds, which are also considered youth. So this is quite a different type of people.
They're very different type of people, and I've been puzzled by these new definitions, who is who, and you want sometimes like cheer up when you're in the different category than you thought you are in. But by and large, whatever the label you put it on, it's still like the people that are in very early stages of their life, when were getting their professional lives and other elements of the life in some kind of established order. And not everybody follows the same pattern, but I think these are the things that we have to talk about rather than labels.
Mm. Well, so here's a question really about our plans, NATO StratCom COE plans for 2021. And the question is, what is your narrative as StratCom COE for 2021? Key messages and your vision, and who will define the benchmarks for success?
Well, the benchmarks, the two ways to define that. First is formally, it's always our steering committee. That is the governing body of our center. They will be defining the benchmarks. But of course, to me, the benchmark is how we, through what we've been doing that particular year, been able to improve at least a little bit, either the understanding or capability to operate in this environment for the governments, for the military, for allies, for partners. So has there been any kind of real life impact? Because one of the things that I think also is very clear contemporary phenomenon, we're getting less and less of science impact of a everyday debate. They sit on their ivory tower. Few people can understand what they talk about, and therefore they basically most of the time shut out on the normal public debate, which is a big problem. Because science is knowledge. That gives us the understanding of what we are, where we are, and where we're heading. So to me, therefore, just having a knowledge doesn't qualify as a success. To me, that knowledge that is making an impact is what I'm trying to hope my colleagues and our work can deliver. So that would be my point. And of course, for us, the key narrative is to look through the work to make everybody better understand where we are in the information space, understand the trajectory and new risks, and make therefore people better prepared. And the new element in that narrative is going to be get the tools also prepared for those that want to operate in that environment, have to deliver for the military or the government or otherwise, to get these tools for them. Because I think we've been very much relying on the many old 20th century techniques, although yes, we know you have to have a Twitter account and Facebook and etc., but by and large it's been pretty outdated in most of the governmental structures, and try to find the ways that we kind of practically can help.
And well, we already know our program of work for 2021, and one of the questions is, what are the priorities of the Center of Excellence for 2021? You kind of answered that, but can you tell a bit maybe more about some of the researches that the Center is planning to do in 2021?
Well, obviously we're looking at in multiple areas, and we'll have to see how the 2021 really looks like. As this year just taught us, is we might make any plans we wish for, and then a little virus comes in and all is down the drain, and so many other things change. So okay, from the perspective as it is right now, I think what we will be looking at how our potential or existing adversaries are developing their capabilities. To me, it's in particular Russia and China. We've increasingly zoomed on China as a new actor and will continue to do so. Then we are looking at the technology and the way technology transforms this whole environment, and there'll be a number of work strengths in that, and we'll use our wonderful experts in AI, big data, and cognitive scientists to make sense of these new technologies. For me, for instance, the 5G enabled Internet of Things, and that the way it can transform and will transform the way we consume information is one of the fundamental interesting areas. And then of course it's about creating tools. We're looking at creating a new training platforms, very much different. We're looking at the ways we can exploit or use the virtual reality or augmented reality technologies for solutions, or helping create solutions for training and information environment understanding reasons. And of course we will be hopefully able to agree on certain fundamental doctrinal things next year. It's of course about the nations, but that's also, I think, very important element. And of course we'll continue a number of the projects we've done. Nordic Baltic, I think, has been interesting. We recently launched a product on the information laundering, but there'll be more to come next year. The same on number of other actors. So yes, there's almost 60 points on our program of work. Every one of them is important. Some probably will have more impact on the environment. Some will be probably more narrowly focused, but there'll be a lot of work for us.
Yeah, well, there's also a question about to what extent is Center of Excellence cooperating with the private sector to prepare them for all the security issues you have raised?
Well, we've been very open to the private sector, and of course, saying we're open doesn't mean that everything works fine. Private sector is huge, and we've had in some cases like our own information bubbles where we establish relationship with some private sector companies, and there's more cooperation because of that. In some areas we probably lack some of it, but by and large I would say that we've been very much focused, and I hope that next time we'll have a proper rigorous StratCom dialogue. I always had that idea that I want to have a marketplace for solutions for the practitioners, and my idea is that when we have a proper StratCom dialogue where people come in and you see people in person, and lots of them, and you can chat very close to each other and not over the big distances, then we will be able to create a kind of parallel element that is a marketplace where the companies that have solutions for the practitioners in a StratCom environment can come in and present their product. So I hope that will also be one of the angles how we can boost our cooperation with the private sector, because yes, I agree, much of the innovation is there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that also Center also always has seen itself as like a bridge between the private sector, the academia, and the government and military sectors, and it shows in our different projects that we're having. For example, we actually started this year's StratCom talks with 3 conversations with people coming from private sector and telling about their challenges that they're having. And speaking of challenges, there's another question from Amanda Coleman, and her question is, what are the top 3 things communicators need to develop in 2021, learning from 2020?
I think for me, one key thing that we really have to dig more into is the way human brain works. I've been very much fascinated by the most recent research from different sciences, neurosciences and others, that try to kind of finally get some better understanding of how human brain works. And to me personally, that has been one of these vectors how I better understood the public reactions to what was COVID, and how and why people did what they did in this way or that way during that pandemic. So I think that's a skill if you don't say, well, I know it very well where the latest science and all these things, I would certainly recommend to do so. Second is make data-driven decisions. I know many try, and I know many do that, but sometimes these data sets on which they make these decisions are very narrow, so already pre-biased. But increasingly introducing quality, comprehensive data for your decision making in the campaign planning and etc. etc. And the last thing for communicators, I would say, convince the decision makers that the communication starts with a decision.
Yes, well, give me a second. I will. Yes, so another question is about the impact of COVID. What has been the impact of COVID on the work strands in 2019? Well, it really, I think it's meant for 2020. And how is COVID in general influencing the work at the COE?
Well, luckily...
Well, not really.
No,
I mean, everything is as it was last year.
No, actually, from the output perspective, we've been quite successful to shift from, basically office and, face-to-face work to the remote work. Of course, the training has suffered, especially the place where, you have to have a large segments of people to train and go through different elements. That's where there's been an issue. But other than that, I think our own, because, you can still use the brain. For some would argue that at your home it's more difficult. I have many kids at home, so it's complicated. But for some, home is actually the better place to think. So on that part, we've been okay. COVID, of course, it impacts everything across multiple vectors. First, for us, it's a beautiful case study. It's perverse to say beautiful related to COVID, but it looks like that because you see the extreme. And by and large, what I would say is you could see this new information environment, what I label is the revolution of the information environment, playing out within the extreme circumstances, and people get carried because of that in very different directions. And I think that as a case study has been very interesting. And basically, to me, I remember when back in the school I was reading about the medieval Europe, medieval Latvia, and at one point Latvia was actually considered the hub of the witches and werewolves of Europe. That's probably because we're pretty paganic. And the practice is how other people were burning these werewolves and witches, and what did they think of? What's the logic of this? How to test a witch? You wrap him in.
Usually
and then,
her.
Yeah, and put in the water. If she drowns, well, sorry, she wasn't. If she floats, then that's a witch. We have to burn that. So it was always puzzling, what was happening in these human minds. And well, now within the COVID circumstances, I kind of recognize that, and of course understanding also from a recent research how the human brain works is actually, we're not far from that. Some of those instinctive elements under the severe crisis and pressure are still within us. And I think that's a good thought to have. And that's why I think we sometimes have to remember that if you follow the science, you shouldn't be surprised that at some point this man of enlightenment just disappears. And that's also, I think, something that I take it from COVID environment is we can be better, but in a certain circumstances we as humans can be pretty bad.
Yes, and the fear that people feel is real.
Oh, yeah, well, of course, humanity has always lived with the pandemics. It's just that the 20th century has been comparatively decent to us, that's first. And secondarily, I guess we have instinctive fear of these things. And of course, once fear kicks in, which one of the basic instincts for survival, that upends many of the rational processes in the human brain, and then we see what comes out.
Well, in 2019, in a few of the talks that you were giving, I know that people were sometimes inviting you because you had like a very gloomy take on the future and on the role of social media and what's going to happen to data, and were inviting you to kind of scare people a bit or scare their audiences. And during this year, how many times have you felt this feeling of "told you so"? And that
No, I
you had
actually,
envisaged
I'm not
something
dwelling
like that.
on these feelings. I actually pretty much recognize that because I've spent most of my time and career in national security, different places and establishments. I'm trained to think in the worst case scenarios. So that's why I'm thinking. Unfortunately, that's what more or less is happening more than 50% of the time. So I think that's where we have to also learn that I don't. I hope that what I tell to people is not going to happen. But unfortunately, the way we as a societies interact, the way we bring things forward, makes these unfortunate or bad scenarios more likely. And I think, especially on the technology, and I cannot underline it less, we're developing right now as humanity very fundamental the technologies that fundamentally will change things. It is already, but the pace will just keep up. And we as humans are very hard pressed to adapt adequately to that. And that creates circumstances which are high risk circumstances. And I don't think it's going to disappear. It will be increasingly hard to navigate that environment for positive outcomes. Not that technology in its own right is good or bad, it's just a technology. It's how we as humans can adapt and use that for good rather than for bad. And that's where I think the biggest risk is. And yes, of course, yeah, 2020 has actually highlighted a lot of issues that we as a center have been talking about for a long time now, and I'm not happy about that. I would rather fail in my predictions.
Yes. Well, another question is about the importance of strategic communications. So, do you feel that the pandemic has affected the understanding of the importance of strategic communications? And maybe, if you can think of something on the spot, what is the most colorful example you can name?
Well, I think yes, absolutely. Strategic communications, I think, has been it has been also before pandemic the buzzword, but now with infodemic and all of that, it has entered the everyday lives. Everybody, like in most of the households, they would recognize the name and would be able to have a dinner chat over that. Well, probably I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the idea that pandemic and how bad it is dependent on the way humans behave. And that's what successful strategic communication have to shape in a way that they do as is best for them and as well as for the whole society. And it has not been the case most of the time. And that's, I think, where we've seen that where there's been a success in mitigating. There's been kind of a mutual kind of interdependency. Let's put it like two examples: Latvia, spring, and New Zealand. Latvia in spring had very low cases, quick lockdown, quickly went out, and no big impact compared to many other countries. Those were kind of mutual kind of feeling that everything is very good. Similarly to New Zealand, also, and everybody was, oh yeah, we're doing something right, it's adequate, and etc. etc. And that's where you could say, okay, it was good. There was government that did things, there was a society that accepted and behaved. But then fast forward, fall this year, Latvia and New Zealand probably not in fall, but earlier, once again they started to have a surge, very strict lockdown, and went out pretty successful, and still having this feeling of successful strategic communication and crisis management in Latvia. The change was to have a much more gradual approach. And of course also the fatigue and to seeing other nations doing differently, that has created a very different dynamic where everybody says it's such a bad strategic communications. So I think one of the examples I would say is you cannot do that in vacuum. If you want to have a successful outcome, that's a synergy between the decision maker and the population. And of course for the population to take the decision makers' points and views and recommendations, there has to be the doing part that works very well. And I think that's where a number of nations have missed the target.
Mm. So here's another, which is a bit more of a comment and then a question as well. It's going to be a bit long. So Jānis, one issue NATO is still facing from my experience, and this is a question by Peter Mientus, is that StratCom as a joint function has not been fully understood by the majority of our leadership at strategic, operational and tactical level. What is your StratCom COE part in the information campaign to boost the importance of StratCom for military leaders as well as the governmental, political and civilian sector? Which influence do you actually have? And which measures are planned to be taken to get closer to real multiplicators and influencers?
Well, I agree with the assessment that there's significant room for improvement, but I would caveat that with it has improved already since like 4 or 5 years ago when I kind of started to work in this environment. There's more understanding, it's far from universal, and still this idea that StratCom is just pure communication that you give to a communicator is still persistent. What we're trying to do, obviously, as the StratCom Center of Excellence, without having any kind of authority per se, just this authority of knowledge, is to talk to the leadership and demonstrate through the cases and the research and experimentation what really delivers and what are the risks if you don't do the right way. But of course it's short in time and etc. etc. What increasingly we're trying to zoom in is that every single staff level college has to have a element of training for strategic communications, not as a PR, but a proper strategic communication, understanding what influences human mind and the influence of actions and experiences, including also the pure communication, and to do that also at a higher level. And ultimately, you have to train that thing. You have to exercise the information warfare like you do a land or sea or combined joint warfare. That has to be implemented. It is going in that direction, but more can be done. So it's been a progress, but there's still road ahead of us.
Yeah, and another question that continues actually the conversation that we're having here is from Laura Laughlin. She says, I'm interested in hearing your insights for how NATO and nations can operationalize the StratCom insights coming out of the COE studies in the past year. So basically how these insights have been enforced maybe in allied countries.
Well, they make their choices. That's not our choices to make. Every single piece that we come up with has this element of so what? So what do you do with that knowledge? Well, in some cases, of course, it's about just understanding better your opponent's modus operandi, the new techniques, methodologies, etc., etc. That's kind of, yes, there's an added value, but not like the significant added value. Then when we bring in the experimentation, for instance, with the soldiers that you mentioned back in 2018, well, there's a very straight implication. You can go back to your military, look at the way your military personnel is dealing with all of that environment, and decide what is acceptable risk and what not, and then thus change your standard operational procedures for that. I know that number of nations did actually change their standard operational procedures because of that experiment that we did. Similarly, we can be, and we've been involved in a number of exercises that have been shaped in number of nations or group of nations on the information related effects, and design them in a way that there's a kind of ability to test some certain solutions. The other element where certainly we want to contribute with the knowledge and understanding is the information environment assessment. What is critical to understand what happened in the information environment? I think that's also one part of what we can contribute to that work. And ultimately, of course, very practical thing, doctrines, you know, how to documents. They're not finished yet, but hopefully, as I've said, we will have that. And I will also make sure that there's a certain set of guidelines, A. B, there's a commonality. As well. And of course, there are many other ways one can use. But it's up to the recipients.
A very interesting question actually comes in from YouTube, and it goes like this: in 5 to 10 years, will StratCom be operated mainly by AI, and only the narratives will be human guided?
That is possible. I think AI will improve considerably, and I do agree that some of these technological developments will significantly change and the way we operate. And of course, one big piece, I think the first place where AI will take the human role was be to understand what's happening. Because I think the ability to go across all the elements of the information space, different small groups, different very divergent information bubbles, I think humans will increasingly not be able. So that's the first role. And I think there'll be more roles. I do think that decisions, of course, will still be carried by the humans. But also that will also point to one very significant, what I've also alluded in the early talk that I had, and that's what happens with data. And I think we have to be very careful of allowing the data to freely go everywhere. In a way, that's part of innovation. I respect and understand that. But if somebody with the wrong intentions amasses enough of the big data of a given society, from my perspective that I have, it's absolutely big national security threat that can be used in multiple ways. So I think that will be the other question about the AI, because AI, of course, is dependent on data. and quality of data, and that will be, I think, the other element that will become very significant: access to data, access to quality data, and who has what. That will be then detrimental to the quality of the AI decisions that will come out of that.
Well, it seems we are slowly running out of time, and the last question would be actually a good beginning for to start thinking about our next discussion that we are going to have on 6th of January about communications surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine. And this question goes like this: what, in your opinion, drives people most to protest against COVID-19 safety measures? Disinformation, economic pressure, both, or something else?
It's a mixture of things, and of course in specific circumstances it might vary, but I think it's all three. First and foremost, it's internal motivation. I think people feel insecure. I think they feel economically deprived. Their future plans have collapsed. And of course, probably their starting point for security was not very high. So they're already were insecure. And then they are easier victims for disinformation that provide easy answers, find somebody to blame, and give also this perspective. In fact, that's not that dangerous. It's just that others make it look very dangerous, and it's a kind of psychological escape for many. The worst kind of people are the ones that are trying to use those people for benefit. Either that's financial benefit, for gaining network of followers, or political benefits. All that is bad. I think that's the ones that are really kind of, I would say, malign actors. But for most people, it's about finding the way to navigate yourself with huge internal insecurities without good future perspectives, and that's, I think, the key element. And of course, the fact that it is so easy to deliver that disinformation and make those people targets for the encircling them with that kind of alternative worldview.
All right. Well, I will use the opportunity as a moderator to ask the last question. And we have talked a lot about things that we will see in 2021. But can you elaborate a bit on which things we will not be talking about in 2021? What will be obsolete?
What will be obsolete? I think it will, nothing comes into mind that will be like the big thing that will just disappear in 2021. I can actually point to some areas where there's a downward trajectory, and I'm afraid it's going to continue. So first one is being able to unite a nation. Very, very bad tendency, but I think that will be increasingly the fragmentations. That force is going to keep on working. Second, impact of media, traditional media. It's been going downwards, and it will continue to do so. Let's look at some of the recent examples where a simple YouTube TV channel might have a much more profound effect on the given population than, you know, a very well established media. So I think that will be something that will also happen, and we will be trying to find the solutions, but I don't think that wheel can be reversed anymore. It's just about creating the system for this new environment. And yes, handwriting probably is going to disappear more and more as we're becoming everyone more digital. I see you do a little bit of handwriting, but I think it's increasingly the scarce skill of being able to write, and that is going to be disappearing skill. Yeah, these are the ones that I could, you know, quickly come up with.
Yes, well, thank you, Jānis, for your wonderful insights and looking at the crystal ball that you are clearly hiding somewhere. And yes, well, Also, thank you everyone who was watching and asking questions. We really value our strategic communications community. Many tens of thousands of people actually have watched our StratCom talks during these 3 months. Many of you have asked questions and given your comments, and we really value that. And we hope that you will continue following us next year. The first conversation that we're going to have next year will focus on disinformation surrounding vaccines, and is going to be happening on January 6th. Well, same place and same time. So see you there, and happy holiday season, I guess.
Well, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, everyone, and stay safe.
Yes.